Hello, dear viewers. Welcome to the Merry Corncrakes, the show affiliated with the Corncrake magazine, which celebrates English literature past and present, trying to bring you great authors from the past, such as Charles Dickens, and present authors in our sphere trying to do good stories. And today we're probably dealing with one of the highest peaks in terms of English literature. In this month's Corncrake, we have a few speeches from Henry V, which is a fantastic play, and it really is perhaps Shakespeare's most clearly like a very heroic character in Henry V, but also very tied to English identity or a certain English kind of celebration of England. And so we're going to look at that today, and I'm delighted to have on the show Academic Agent to do this. Hello, AA. How are you doing, sir?
Well, thanks for having me, Nathan. Hot on the heels of Foundations of Shakespeare coming out. This was well timed.
Well, of course. Why don't you tell people a little bit about Foundations of Shakespeare?
Well, I took a very long time to put it together because it's quite I mean, I have a background as a Shakespeare scholar, and so I had decades worth of notes and old lectures I'd given, and bits of I'd written for articles. Obviously, I've got 5 books on that I published on Shakespeare as well. So it was almost like kind of putting together like a greatest hits compilation. But also I was trying to do something interesting in that course, which was how would I present a Shakespeare course that was completely de-wokeified, no modern nonsense, no modern political concerns. So I right at the start, I cut off the scholarship at 1980. Like I rely on old scholars a lot on the course. Although, as I was writing it, I found it was impossible to avoid some newer readings, let's just say. So I didn't strictly stick to the pre-1980 rule I set myself. But yeah, a lot of people have started taking it already. Been pleased with how many people have got it. It's only been out a week or so. And I can see that people are working their way through the course. There are 5 lectures even before you get to the first play, which is Midsummer Night's Dream. So we do 8 plays on there. But yeah, I mean, if people are interested in Shakespeare, you should check that out.
Well, there'll be a link in the description below to the course, and hopefully this is a little taster of what people might enjoy. And I kind of want to pick up on something you mentioned there about how more modern academia treats Shakespeare, because certainly in my own research as well, I did early modern religion. I think that is a good rule. Kind of things before 1980 or so tend to be very good scholarship, treating the subject with a degree of reverence, I would say, and respect for the past, trying to understand what happened, even if they're coming from different ideological points of view. Whereas there seems to be a turn, and there's an attempt to kind of deconstruct and maybe subvert the meaning of certain characters or discredit them. And what was interesting about one of the things you've mentioned with Shakespeare is, in a way, he seems to be a lightning rod for a lot of these attacks prior to it becoming more mainstream. And I was wondering why do you think he is such a target of attack? Why does it start with him?
Because within the discipline of English literature, as a kind of university discipline, unless a new school, unless a new critical method or school, theoretical model can work in and through Shakespeare, right? That's the real test. What can you do with Shakespeare? So it tends to land in Shakespeare first and then spread out across the rest of the discipline. The only case I can think of where that was not true was with deconstruction. Deconstruction landed in the Romantic, the deconstructionists were Romantic critics of the the early 19th century or the long 19th century, Wordsworth and Shelley and Keats and so on. And they struggled to do much with Shakespeare. There was a famous reading of King Lear The Dover Cliff scene in King Lear had a famous deconstructionist reading, but for whatever reason, Shakespeare studies didn't take deconstructionism as much as it did in other parts of the discipline. Whereas pretty much every other critical school hits Shakespeare first and then branches out, whether it was Freudian psychoanalysis in the early 20th century, the new criticism, new historicism, cultural materialism, various strands of feminism, post-colonialism, which is frankly bonkers because Shakespeare was a pre-colonial writer, but uh, but there was a famous post-colonial reading of The Tempest as an example. So yeah, I mean, it's because he is the hyper-canonical writer, probably the world's most famous writer, right? So you make a splash in Shakespeare studies, and then people then take what happens there and start doing it in other parts of the discipline. You can make a much bigger splash writing on Shakespeare than you can writing about, I don't know, Alexander Pope or something,
Mm,
right?
yeah, and then, well, that kind of then invites the further question of why is Shakespeare so central to the canon, and because it might seem obvious to many people. Oh, we all learn him in school. Around the world, people learn him in schools. His plays are often on. We're told that he's great, but
Mhm.
actually, there's a history to how he gets to that point. There's a legacy to his work. So why does he have that central place in English literature?
Well, I mean, we could easily spend the next half hour talking about just this question. I think that it's something that I mean, I mentioned Keats just now. Keats had this idea that Shakespeare had what they call negative capability. That is, he had this ability to give a voice even to ideas that he didn't like. Um, so, I mean, let me make an analogy for you, right? George Orwell wrote 1984, and it doesn't really matter what you make of George Orwell or what you make of 1984. When you read that book, you come to the end of it and you think, well, pretty much George Orwell was against totalitarianism. We can say that he wrote this book because he has a political kind of message he's trying to give through this. And through 1984, you get to the end of it and you come out with the idea, well, these totalitarian systems are dangerous or something like that. With Shakespeare, if he had written, like, let's just pretend, I mean, it's absurd in a way to try to make this comparison, but you'll understand what I'm saying. If Shakespeare had written 1984, you just wouldn't know. Was he actually on Big Brother's side? Was he on O'Brien's side? Was he on Julia's side? Was he on Winston's side? You just can't tell. And because of that ability of Shakespeare to just make the argument so good and to see everything, like see every point of view, there's a polyvocal quality to Shakespeare that the plays can always be argued from multiple angles. So a Marxist critic can pick up King Lear and say, oh well, actually this is a proto Marxist play, and there have been famous Marxist readings written on King Lear. Or a feminist can pick up the same play and say, actually, Shakespeare, if you really read between the lines, he was a proto-feminist, or he was actually an arch reactionary and a chauvinist. And this has been done over and over again. Shakespeare was a proto-liberal. Shakespeare was a proto-nationalist, which is what we're going to be talking about now. So there is a quality, a non-didactic quality in Shakespeare that allows him to be endlessly read and reread, performed and reperformed. I think it's something to do with drama as a form. It's kind of less um, because there are lots of different points of view within every single play. There are multiple different kind of characters you could latch onto, or different character arcs. You could say, there are multiple different stories within each play. And because of all of that, it's easier to make Shakespeare the site of all of these critical battles than it would be for writers where it's just kind of clear and obvious what their purpose was. I mean, I'll give an example. Ben Jonson, who was another playwright who was alive at the same time as Shakespeare, a rival playwright, also mates of Shakespeare at one point. Jonson wrote a famous eulogy for Shakespeare where he says, Shakespeare was not just for our time, but for all time, famous quotation. But Ben Jonson writes prefaces to his plays. He says, well, if you're wondering what this play is about, it's a satire about city life, and here's my moral message, and so on and so forth. Well, Shakespeare never writes any prefaces. It's almost unimaginable for Shakespeare to write a little essay at the start saying, "Oh, here's the moral purpose of this one." And because of that, there are some plays where still, even now, I mean, one of the plays I cover on the course, Measure for Measure, nobody's sure how to take it. Nobody's sure where he's coming from or what the moral message is, if there even is one. So, and that makes all of these plays rich and fertile soil, if you want, for all of these different arguments. The flip side of that is that Shakespeare criticism, therefore, quickly becomes very political, and it becomes kind of emotionally charged. So, I mean, to give the example of King Lear, one of the huge critical debates that broke out in the mid-60s was between Christians who said that the end of the play shows a man who has been through a lot, but he didn't give in to despair, and he's redeemed by the end. So ultimately, like, Shakespeare's vision is morally redemptive or something like this. And then a bunch of existential critics and leftist critics and Marxist critics who were like, no, Shakespeare deliberately makes this play as bleak as possible. He removes all possible hope. He removes all salvation. And Lear dies at the end of the play completely heartbroken, having learnt very little. And it's like, okay, ostensibly these two people are arguing over a play, but they're actually arguing over the soul and future direction of Britain as a country, and they're having this argument in 1960. And well, the rest of the 20th century, and you can have a think about which set of critics ultimately, or which moral vision ultimately won out between that. So yeah, this is something. I mean, this is fascinating for us who are into culture and politics and so on. But it's also a difficulty because the further you get into that, you're also like getting away from. Well, hold on a second. There's an actual play here. So one of the things that the reader or the student of Shakespeare has to bear in mind is like, well, okay, is this actually in the text, or is this something that just people want to see there? Do you know what I mean?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's a danger with all historical texts, but I think you've hit the nail on the head with Shakespeare. The fact that he leaves space for, I think, a multiplicity of real characters and human interactions. Then, just like ordinary life, there's room for different interpretations. And as we know in the current moment, people want to see the world in a certain way without seeing the facts of the case often as well. So it can become very dangerous when reading a work like Shakespeare's. And I think is maybe would you say as well, this is also reflective perhaps of an attitude to do with the Renaissance, a turn to the human. I was just thinking in terms of the if you contrast it with maybe like the Greek tragedies with Sophocles and so on, in a way, the characters, the people in those, they might be expressing certain emotions, but everything's kind of set in stone. And there's a I think with something like Oedipus Rex, there's a very clear storyline, and there isn't so much in terms of multiple points of view. There's just the tragedy of a man and his fate in the world. Whereas it seems like in many of Shakespeare's plays, it isn't clear that things are so set in stone, and actually there's an exploration of the human experience more fully than that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a famous book written by a critic called Harold Bloom called Shakespeare and the Invention of the Human, where he somewhat bombastically argues that we have this idea of the three-dimensional character, or of characters having
Yeah.
interiority, and not being just archetypes, but being real people, quote unquote, real people. Bloom in that book argues that Shakespeare basically invented our notion of what that was. Um, I mean, but I should say within the academy, that book was extremely unpopular, to the extent where they put on a conference where critic after critic after critic, dozens of scholars lined up to attack Harold Bloom. I kind of joked in the past, it's like a kind of um, imagine a bunch of rappers recorded an album of diss tracks, all attacking one other rapper, and then didn't invite them to appear on the album. That's a little bit what happened to Harold Bloom there. And again, there are lots of problems with Bloom, but there is something to his basic idea that Shakespeare is doing something different. And you can actually see it. One of the things I do on the course is I insist on having a section where we look at the sources before we actually get into the context and the interpretations, and all of the other parts of the play. We have to look first at the sources that Shakespeare was working from, because then you can see directly what was it that Shakespeare added, and what was it that he changed, and what was it that he kept the same. And I mean, so often Shakespeare's changes are quite radical from the original text. So on this question of interiority or archetypes, the original Hamlet was a tale called Amleth, which is cast as much more of a kind of uh, chivalric romance adventure or something, and it ends with Amleth, having conquered his enemies and making this triumphant speech about how he saved Denmark at the end. Well, I mean, anybody who's seen Hamlet knows the play does not end in that way. There was also, there were several other sources that Shakespeare had, but one of the things that he definitely adds is Hamlet's soliloquies. He had 7 speeches where Hamlet just is on stage on his own, and you're basically watching the mind of this man unravel. You're seeing, the dark night of the soul, if you want, enacted on stage, and you're seeing him work out these things, and he's conflicted, and he's nervous, and he's neurotic, and he doesn't know what to do, and he's reasoning with himself, and we could be watching madness in action. Most of Shakespeare's contemporaries were not doing these sorts of things to the same extent, although there's a few of them. There's a playwright called Thomas Kidd who has kind of similar scenes, but if you read them, you'll see they're a bit clunkier than Shakespeare's. Also, Marlowe, I would say, is another one where he has these, but his speeches are more, they're kind of a little bit more bombastic set pieces, and they're a bit more melodramatic. Whereas Shakespeare, somehow you feel like you're dealing with a real person somehow, grappling with these issues, and they don't quite know where it's going to go. So yeah, I mean, this is one of the things you always have to think about is like, well, what is Shakespeare adding? And yeah, so yeah, let's move on.
Yeah, I think that kind of leads nicely on then, because in one sense, what makes Shakespeare great is he taps into something that's human, and universal might be the wrong word, but it's not tied to a certain group or so on. It's an exploration of human experience from multiple perspectives, and we get that with different plays and different locations. Many take place in Venice, for example, and so on. So then how then does that relate to him being so central to English nationalism or English identity or British identity? And I know certain of his plays focus in more on that, such as Henry V that I mentioned. But then you've got a play like Macbeth, which has a Scottish focus, written at the
Mhm,
time of James the First of England, having been the King of
mhm.
Scotland becoming the King of England. You have mentions of Welsh characters and so on. So how do these kind of relate into that broader experience?
I mean, I think you have to contextualize where Shakespeare was writing in history. They just come through the War of the Roses, in the Tudor period, and then in the Jacobean period. The memory of what had happened just 100 years before was still fresh in the mind, and a permanent um, threat. We don't want social and civil disorder breaking out in the country again after the devastation of the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. I mean, the country was at civil war, uh, and this was a permanent concern, I think, not just for Shakespeare but for the society at large, um, because they'd already seen what happened when this old feudal order had broken down. After Edward III and into that whole period, you're not really dealing with feudalism proper per se, but something that historians have called bastard feudalism, which is, I mean, really speaking, it's where honor and that old chivalric code comes to be replaced with what Carlyle would call cash payment, right? It is the old social bonds have broken down because now it's just about power, and it's just about money and power. And of course, what happened during that time is that you get feudal lords who become self-seeking and capricious, and they start thinking about their appetite, not their commitment to the great chain of being or to God or to their king, but to how can I benefit from this? Okay. And this is a constant concern in all of Shakespeare's plays. I mean, I mentioned King Lear there. What happens in King Lear? He divides the kingdom into three. Well, initially into three, then Cordelia won't play ball. So it ends up being, in two, to Goneril and Regan, who are completely selfish, self-seeking. They have no honor. They're ruled by their appetites and their desires. There's a character called Edmund, who is a bastard, incidentally, um, who is again ruthless and Machiavellian. And what happens is that the social order breaks down completely in King Lear, and you get a kind of Hobbesian dog eat dog world. This also happens in the history plays. By the end of the Henry VI trilogy, Henry VI Part 3, you have these brutal scenes of all out power politics, warring factions, of people killing their cousins and their nephews in front of them. And then it all culminates of course, in Richard III, who, as Shakespeare depicts him, was a monstrous villainous character. Now, of course, there are some political reasons for that at the time. He was writing under the Tudors. There's something called the Tudor myth that Henry VII providentially healed the nation when he united the houses of York and Lancaster. And so a lot of what Shakespeare is doing at this time, whether he knew it or not, was forging a new myth for the country, right? Going back over that recent painful past, and trying to thread together a story of a newly unified nation that's not going to split up into all of these, warring factions and duchies and so on. Um, so the question of patriotism or nationalism, however you want to phrase it, is that Shakespeare in a way is helping create it, is helping to create a sense of what it means to be English, or what it means even to be British later on in his career. Um, Partly that also comes from the changing circumstance of the country. At this time, the Elizabethans had started exploring. They'd started, becoming a colonial power, I guess. They hadn't quite got there in some. It was right at the start of it. You'd have to look to see when Jamestown in America was found out. It was around this time, right? I mean, you'd have to look up the date, but that had just started to happen. But of course, in that, who were the other? There were rival powers. There was the Spanish, who were a superpower at this time. There were the French, of course. There were the Dutch, and these, for like the fact that these all other powers all had their colonial ambitions and their imperial ambitions, um, means that at this time you get a kind of nascent English nationalism as against those darned French or those darned Dutch or those darned Spanish, depending on, circumstances. Sometimes it's more the Spanish, sometimes it's more the Dutch, sometimes it's more the French. Um, but the fact is, there's another rival power there. Um, and you actually see this in some of the figures of the time. Walter Raleigh, who's a well-known figure who went exploring and was said to have brought tobacco, being the first guy to bring tobacco back and things like that. I mean, some of his writings are pretty nationalist. Like he's making arguments like, why should we have foreign goods here at the expense of our farmers? I mean, he sounds like Steve Bannon, like that's who Walter Raleigh sounds like. So you start getting these proto-nationalistic arguments. Now, as ever with Shakespeare, you're not going to get him being like all out, making those sorts of speeches. But those sentiments are registered in the plays. And I think Henry V has got a few very famous nationalistic speeches. The history plays in general. There's a marvelous speech in Richard II by the Bishop of Carlisle, who talks about this, this royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle. So he does clearly have a love for the country, and he's got I think his main concern is for the country to stay unified and together under one power, namely that power being the king at the time. Some people have argued he was kind of basically working as a state propagandist for the Tudors or the Stuarts. I think they go a bit far, because you can always read these plays a different way, as being cautious or sometimes even putting, undermining those arguments. But you'd have to read about those arguments in your own time. But certainly this is part of the idea of the nation. And still, I would argue that it's Shakespeare's like version of history that everybody's got like a meme version of history in their heads. Like clearly the real Richard III was not the arch villain of Shakespeare's play, right? But that's still how basically everybody remembers him. Okay. Again, the real Henry V, he had good points and bad points, but it's Shakespeare's Henry V that people remember, but it's not just those. Those are the ones which are really easy to identify. It's the whole canon. It's all of the plays. It's the comedies as well, and the tragedies too. We talked about King Lear. King Lear is set in a pre-Roman kind of semi-mythical or legendary past, 800 BC. Well, why is Shakespeare going all the way back to that moment? In a pre-Roman, distant, remote Britain. In all of his comedies, he draws on old, forgotten pagan festivals, the kind of folk culture of the country, which comes through in all sorts of hidden ways. There was a famous book by C.L. Barber called Shakespeare's Festive Comedies, which drags out all of those things that you'd miss if you weren't informed about them. The Saturnalia and the Lord of Misrule, and all of these things that are buried deep in the distant past in the culture are all registered in Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare also draws on Chaucer a lot as a hidden source for many of the plays. The Venerable Bede, another kind of semi-forgotten about writer, important. And you see, it doesn't matter if they're Christian, it doesn't matter if they're coming from this place or that place, or Shakespeare takes them all and he puts them into these wonderful plays that we have. So it's like a repository of English history, even if it's not ostensibly about English history as the history plays out. So there we go.
It gives you very much the kind of feel of it in a way, like how people felt about their history and the different characters within it. And maybe just as a kind of final question on this, then, in Henry IV's Part 1 and 2 and Henry V, we have a character called Falstaff, who is larger than life, very famous. He is a bit of a rogue, but also very lovable at the same time. At least that's how he's portrayed by many actors. And I think Orson Welles was obsessed with Falstaff. I think he wanted to be Falstaff in real life in some way. But at the end of Henry IV, there's this kind of dramatic moment where Prince Hal, or soon to be Henry V, has been kind of under the guidance of Falstaff and being led astray. But at his coronation, he sends Falstaff away. And I'm kind of... It got me thinking, this is often seen as, okay, he's casting off his old rebellious life and he's taking up kingship now. And so this is about that. It's about what it requires to be a king. But is there also potentially a contrast of kind of English cultures going on here, or the ways of being England? Falstaff is very much an embodiment of merry old England, the Lord of Misrule, as you were talking about earlier. Whereas if Henry's almost an embodiment of a more unified England, a monarch at the head of England, not all of these different lords. Is there a sense in which there's a conflict there?
It's interesting you put it that way, because I would almost reverse it.
Okay.
I would say that Falstaff, even though he seems like this festive creature from the distant past, is actually a warning of the sorts of attitudes that are coming in, right? Yes, Falstaff is funny and likable and a drunkard and all the rest of it, but he's also very selfish. He is extremely self-seeking. He's a man without honor. In fact, he's got a whole speech which punctures honor, calls it nothing but hot air, and a kind of a set of ways that the elites trick you into giving your life for them. Right? Why should I give my life for you? It's a very bourgeois attitude. It's a kind of a new attitude, if you want to put it that way. Whereas Henry, at least by the end of the play, is actually trying to appeal to an older, chivalric, aristocratic order where honor is truly the thing that's ruling the day. Okay. Now, again, with your Machiavellian cynical hat on, you'd be like, yeah, Henry, do you really believe this, though? That's an argument for a different day. Ultimately, if Hal is going to fulfill his destiny and become the king that England needs, he needs to reject this cynical bourgeois attitude of Falstaff's. I think the conventional reading of the play is that it's important that the audience understands that Falstaff is rejected and despised at the end of the play because he needs to be, which is kind of it's almost like crushingly moral. It's like, oh my gosh, Shakespeare's just this is a cold ending. But you've got to remember that that's a very modern response, that we have become more like Falstaff, and so the embodiment of the great chain of being that Henry is trying to be at the end feels chilly and remote and cold, and Falstaff feels warm and familiar. So I always think I think that Shakespeare, despite being middle class and despite making a great deal of wealth in his own time, I think that ultimately his sympathies are always with the older chivalric order. That he's not a romantic. He makes it clear in the comedies that he's not a capital R romantic, but he is definitely got a rose-tinted view of the old feudal order. This is something he shares with Carlyle, I think, that he ideally wants to go back and he fears going forward. And it turns out a lot of his fears about social order breaking down, I mean, let's not forget the English Civil War was 30 years later. So he was picking up on something where these two forces, the bourgeois and the aristocratic, would actually come, it would actually turn into a civil war. And by the time you get to the Glorious Revolution, your great chain of being is dead forever. So he was picking up on that.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to bring this conversation to a close, and I hope you viewers are intrigued more by Shakespeare and want to do foundations of Shakespeare. Where can they go and do this, AA? Where can they buy it?
Just at the academic agency. If you stick it into Google, or if you go on my on my YouTube, the links are all there. And hopefully this is a taster. I mean, the thing is, you could easily spend your whole life studying Shakespeare, as many people I know have done.
Well, thank you for your time, academic agent. Very much appreciated. Thank you to you, viewers, and we shall catch you next time. Bye for now.